Welcome to this afternoon's press conference about international crimes in Venezuela, where we will touch upon extrajudicial killings, torture, political prisoners, and the crime of forced displacement, all of which have occurred and are occurring in Venezuela today. Our speakers this afternoon include Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, the Executive Director of the Casla Institute, Tamara Suju, the former Chief of Citizen Security of the City of Caracas and former political prisoner and now Special Commissioner for Security and Intelligence of the Democratic Venezuelan Embassy in Washington, Ivan Simonovic, and of course the United States Special Representative for Venezuela, Elliott Abrams. The speakers will present in that order. Also with us today at the head table is Venezuela's Democratic Ambassador to the OAS, Gustavo Tarre Briceño. And I'd also like to recognize the presence in the audience of Ambassador Carlos Trujillo, U.S. Ambassador to the OAS, the presence also of Adrienne Ross, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere's Affairs. The speakers will present their remarks in both English and Spanish, and for those who need them, there should be interpretation devices in the room. Without further ado, I'd like to offer the floor to Secretary General Almagro.
Gracias.
Thank you very much to each and every one of you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence, for attending this press conference and heeding the invitation. You've heard us repeatedly discuss the situation of systematic human rights violations in Venezuela. We've continued working over the course of this time since the first report we released in March of 2016 up until the date of the last report released on the situation of the Pemon people in Venezuela. The logic behind the criminal logic behind the regimen has to do with how it imposes by force, using certain parameters to crack down and oppress, and this is the basis of their holding power. This dynamic has to do with many different instruments that have been devised at this time. All of these instruments have been denounced in good time, and that's what we're discussing today. And they're still used, and we've denounced human rights violations of torture against Colonel Mejia. And we every day receive reports on the situation of military members who are in jail, and each and every one of the political prisoners. There's levels of torture, further political prisoners, killings, extrajudicial killings, murders, etc. The parameters of forced displacement of the Pemon people. And this is consistent. It happens repeatedly. It's over the course of these last years, and that's why in our report it points to crimes against humanity in Venezuela. And the ongoing string of charges and denunciations have been ongoing. There may be a process of dialogue and course, and yet there's torture and murders, killings, extrajudicial killings. There's torture underway. There's new political prisoners. However, despite the talks, the regime just views it as business as usual. And the pressure is just the price of doing business to be able to stay in power. It has to do with the use of pretty much each one of the different crimes, criminal offenses that are crimes against humanity under international law. Each one of these offenses, each one of these types of crimes against humanity has been violated by the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro. Each one of these crimes has been repeated and has despite international pressure that there might have been exerted on the government, despite any mediation, any talks to bring about a new political agenda, however, the torture and murder of many was just relegated to oblivion and ignores the victims of the regime and ignores the situation of the refugees and asylum seekers from Venezuela throughout the rest of the world. I wanted to focus just briefly at this time on what we have recently brought to light, the military attack, which is disproportionate against the Pemon people to force its displacement. This is what's behind this is the same logic that behind what's happening in all the neighborhoods in Venezuela. It has to do with how the victims are identified through intelligence operations, those who are dissidents, those who raise their voice against the dictatorship, and how that voice that's raised against the dictatorship all of a sudden is an inconvenience in the neighborhood, in the building, in the house, or whatever. And how each one of these persons is compelled to migrate based on threats or extrajudicial killings or threats against the family lead them to migrate. In the Pemon people, this happened, started before, and it's ongoing, and there's been attempts to provide humanitarian aid. The efforts of the regime, obviously, of displacing this people, the Pemon people, the purpose of it is very clear. It's of criminal nature. It's to strengthen this operational, criminal operational logic in that area where the Pemon people are found. This effort allows illegal mining, drug trafficking to take place freely, and obviously the smuggling, contraband, and distortion of the economy, which for the Venezuelan government and the usurping government, the power-grabbing government, it's of benefit to it and its associates. So what we need is justice brought to the people. This justice has to do with identifying the chain of command, which took part in this operation, the 5,000 military and civilians who acted against the Pemon people, the minister of the government who took this action that violated who gave the orders against this a division general, brigade general, two commanders, different high senior military people. This shows the importance that was attached by Maduro to these criminal activities that were carried out in this area, obviously, to displace the Pemon people and for it to cease control of its own territory. And now what remains to do is to provide reparation to the Pemon people, those murdered. According to the reports, there's dozens and dozens, many more than the 7 that are officially recognized by the people, and the dozens that have been wounded, hurt, and tortured, people who ended up in the hospitals, or those who were murdered, or those who were put in jail as political prisoners. No doubt, no question, that this led to 1,200 Pemone members to be displaced so that they could be massacred. Each one of the witnesses to these events, each one of those who were wounded and injured, each person who reported torture, it didn't matter. It was across the board. It didn't matter whatever sex they were, no matter age they were. It didn't matter what health condition they were in. Nothing mattered. It was a crackdown for the sake of engaging in a crackdown. They definitely couldn't find justice under the usurping regime. So far from that, to be able to come up with any solution through the current power-grabbing government. These communities would find no justice that way, so no doubt we must seek in the international community justice to be able to sort out these issues. And the support to the report of the High Commissioner, UN High Commissioner, has provided to the reports of the Organization of American Studies in 2016. These are welcome, these reports from the High Commissioner of the UN. And we didn't expect anything more than a continuation of the prior work, the predecessor, and the technical teams that have been engaging in this effort. Yes, I believe there's been an expansive effect of this report in and of itself, because ideologically speaking, it couldn't be understood. Certain things were just inexplicable, but perhaps now we've cracked open the issue and we have shed light on this torturing, oppressive, murdering regime.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Systematic repression and the commission of crimes against humanity has a face today after the Rafael Acosta's murder because of being tortured in it. And he was agonizing before a judge. A few months ago, he was murdered under the same conditions and in the custody of the state. Councilman Alban, who faked that he committed suicide in the same week that Alban was murdered. Modesto Diaz was also murdered, who is at the Helicoide prison, and he was denied timely medical treatment. There were two cases that we pushed forward, and there were victims who were tortured, and they were subjected to cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the same place where they were being tortured, and then they were tortured again. But there were several cases in which with toxic gas in plastic bags, they were smothered, many victims, and during interrogations, these persons today could become victims who were murdered through torture. Capitan Rafael Acosta and several of those detained in his case were taken to the outskirts of Caracas. They was hung naked by his arm, and he was tied to a tree with his eyes covered. It seemed to be a horror movie where several human beings were hanging above each other in different trees, screaming, and heard each other screaming. They beat him with sticks and throughout his body, and with knees and thorax throughout his body, and then they harassed him and next to his ears with it. They put acid on him, and we don't know whether it was in these trees or in the basement of the jail where the electric shock treatment was given. Torture was given him, and then there were victims that were hung in the same way from the trees and outside, and they were beaten in the way that I just described. But they've also their feet were cut with scalpels on their legs, and they were burned. They were oil was put on them. They were lit ablaze, and then electric shocks was given them, and they played Russian roulette with them. I want to remind that children and young people who have been detained from age 13 on, and they have been beaten savagely without taking into account their physical condition. They've been smothered with toxic gases. They've been burned. They've been shot with rubber bullets. They've been forced to eat excrement. They've been stripped, and they've been victims of lascivious acts, and others, and some have even been raped. There's young people who have lost their eyesight. They've become disfigured or paraplegic. We've seen that in this this first half of the year, 72 new direct victims of torture have been reported. To add to them, the forced disappearance, temporary ones, and arbitrary detention and sexual violence as well. Some of these 72 new victims have been tortured, as the others have been. These testimony we add to the 11 cases from 2018 and the 430 reports from between 2013 and 2017. Today we have 13 cases where Cubans are directly involved in execution of the torture. The new patterns show that a refrigerator to causing the victims to have all sorts of physical problems and then faint. The use of acids or other unknown substances that are injected in the victims, or they were provided through the bleeding wounds and dislocating their members and grabbing their testicles or kicking them until they faint, trying to rape them with poles and then putting it into their mouth, and then being confined in cells that are totally dark, blacked out, hooded for day after day, and making them eat like animals on the floor until that they relieve themselves on top of it, causing infections in their genitals. The beating and kicking with sharp objects and and punching has taken place in 100% of the cases, as well as hangings and electric shocks. Sexual violence has been present in 100% of all the cases this year. We have registered on record 27 attempts of rape attempts, 28 cases of lascivious acts, and 1 case of actual rape. The wounds in the wrist and the loss of sensibility in the feet and on feet is another pattern of conduct in these acts. To finish up, the repressive conduct in this systematic repression, because in the persecution and arbitrary detentions and forced disappearance and the kidnapping, the extrajudicial killings and torture, all is part of the criminal system that is imposed on the people in Venezuela. It's all linked together. It's all one and the same. Nothing is executed in Venezuela without Nicolás Maduro and his criminal structure doesn't know it and orders it. It's a mechanism to punish and paralyze through fear to the population, and this is one of the reasons of the great huge exodus throughout the rest of the continent from Venezuela. Thank you. Thank you, Tamara. Commissioner Simonovic. Good afternoon. Firstly, I want to thank the media, and on behalf of the Venezuelan people, I'd like to thank all of you for all the actions that most of the countries, huge majority of the countries, have put forward on behalf of us to get rid of the Maduro regime, and also Luis Almagro. I'd like to thank the Secretary General of the OAS for the effort he has made for reinstitutionalizing democracy, because to bring the country back to democracy, and the efforts made as well, particularly in Venezuela, by Elliott Abrams, who's been very concerned and who's a person who's full-time devoted to this task. I know that a lot has been mentioned about the Venezuelan situation, but I can't help mention more. My country is suffering from a dictatorship. It's one of the dictatorships that, and without exaggeration, has been one of the worst ever over the last 100 years in Latin America. It's one of the worst. 1, 2, testing. It's one of the worst dictatorships because this is a corrupt and murderous dictatorship. It's a corrupt dictatorship because there's been robbery of the resources of the state, of an entire country. They've been robbed. Those senior officials of Maduro's regime, they have the rest of the country starving and without any medicines. They are carrying out the murders. Thanks to them, there's been the money has been stolen. There's no electricity in Venezuela. There's no potable water. There's no services. The basic services that are necessary for a nation are not working, and none of it works because the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro and his criminal entourage has stolen all the money. And it's murderous. It's murderous because the people decided to take to the streets. People have taken to the street, but how has the dictatorship reacted to them and responded? Just as it always is in this type of regime with violence. They persecute people, they arrest people, they murder people. A few minutes ago I just was given a list, but between 2014 and 2019, 269 people have been murdered. In addition to that, we have to talk about the 800 political prisoners, 600 civilians, and 200 military members. The military members are having a worse time of it than the civilians because the military are viewed as carrying out a betrayal against the state, treason against the state. There's electricity is cut all the time. It's not only... But in the last 2 weeks, how many other people have been arrested as well? How many other people? This hasn't come to an end. How many people have been arrested? And what happens after the Bachelet report, which has been issued? It's been released. What is the world waiting for to react with this complex situation taking place? When a person goes to the doctor and the doctor says he has a disease and says, what's the cure? When you ask, what's the cure? What's the cure to do it and put an end to the dictatorship is what we have to ask. And when we're on the subject of human rights, I am a victim of human rights violations in my own country. For 15 years, I was a political prisoner. I was arrested in November of 2004. I was prosecuted for a crime in which I had nothing to do. And 30 years in prison was my sentence. 5 of my friends are still in Ramo Verde jail. They're still in jail. I was in a jail where for 9 years I only had access of 32 days of sunshine. I was transferred and handcuffed many kilometers, and they harmed my wrists with the handcuffs. I had problems. For the rest of my life, I'm going to have to shoulder the burden of these physical problems that I'm a witness of what's happening, of the torture that takes place in Venezuela. So the question I pose at this time is, what's next? What are we going to do? I don't know if in reality, I was telling Mr. Abrams the other day, my concern at this time is, what are we supposed to do now? If people are tired of anything, it's of assessment, diagnostic assessment, to hear what's wrong. What else does the world need to know to understand what's going on in my country? This is something horrendous. And while we're up here talking, people are dying or being arrested for just tweeting, and I'm proof of this. Less than a month ago, I was a prisoner. It was tough for me to get out of the country, but I got out of it. I'm saying this to Venezuelans, that don't fall into the bottomless pit of despair. We must continue. We must move forward, and we hope the world supports us to leave this dictatorship behind.
Muchas gracias, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
I'm very pleased to be here today at the OAS with this panel and with the Secretary General. The current state of affairs, as it has been described, is not normal or acceptable for the Venezuelan people or for the people of the neighboring countries, who have all had to bear the burden of the Maduro regime's brutality. We've all now seen the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, presenting the evidence that the Venezuelan General Directorate of Military counterintelligence, the DGCIM, and the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, the VIRIN, are abusing and torturing detainees. These reports include, as we have heard, beatings, asphyxiation, sexual abuse, cutting the soles of the feet with razor blades, electric shocks, food deprivation, death threats to family members. In January of this year, Human Rights Watch and Foro Penal similarly reported that security forces used asphyxiation, electric shocks, food deprivation again, death threats against soldiers accused of plotting. Just this week, we learned that 10 female prisoners in DGCIM custody were taken from their prison cells and moved on Monday to an unknown location. Their whereabouts remain unknown, despite inquiries from their families, lawyers, and representatives in the National Assembly. We are all aware of the case of Capitan de Corveta Rafael Acosta Arevalo, a naval officer who died while in the custody of Maduro's thugs and their Cuban advisors. This week, the regime denied the repeated requests of Captain Acosta's family to obtain custody of his remains, and instead, the regime took the body and buried the body, presumably in an attempt to conceal the evidence of his brutal mistreatment. And this would not be the first time the Maduro regime has killed a political prisoner. We all, I think, recall the horrifying events of October 2018, when the Councilman Fernando Alban was, by all indications, murdered while in regime custody. The report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights cites the killing last year, in 1 year, of 5,287 Venezuelans for what the regime called resisting authority during security operations. And from January to May of this year, another 1,569 deaths. We support the call from the High Commissioner for Human Rights to disband the FICE, the National Police Special Action Force, which her report holds responsible for a significant portion of what the report called extrajudicial executions. All of this is part of a wider pattern of repression. Foro Penal has reported on more than 2,000 people arrested since January of this year for political reasons. It has reported that 700, nearly 700, political prisoners are being held. At least 38 journalists have been detained this year, according to NGOs, and hundreds of Venezuelan journalists are living in exile. 118 members of the National Assembly have suffered reprisals since 2016. As you know, many are in exile, or some have sought refuge in foreign embassies, and we should stop for a moment and thank the democracies that are protecting these democratic voices in embassies in Caracas. The arrest of the first Vice President of the National Assembly, Edgar Zambrano, and National Assembly Deputy Juan Requesens demonstrates how far the regime will go to stifle any dissent. The United States calls on the democracies of the world to join us in condemning all of these violations of human rights, and we appeal to countries that have not yet formally recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president to do so as soon as possible, as Greece did this week, and call upon them to withdraw any remaining support for the regime's de facto hold on power. As you know, as a result of the corruption, mismanagement, and repression, more than 4 million Venezuelans have had to leave their homeland. And unless there's change in Venezuela soon enough, it will be 5 million. The burden on neighboring countries is very great and growing. And I want to state our thanks to the governments of those countries, especially Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and the islands that are part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, for their generosity toward Venezuelan migrants and refugees. The United States also supports the ongoing work of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the mechanisms it has established to support human rights and democracy in Venezuela. And we urge the full implementation of the recommendations issued by the Commission for the people of Venezuela. We welcome the historic announcement this week that the Commission on Human Rights will be visiting Venezuela, the first time in over a decade. To conclude, I would just say no dictatorship lasts forever. Yet every day the illegitimate Maduro regime persists is also another day of repression, another day of torture and suffering and humiliation for the Venezuelan people. So we must all come together and support the people of Venezuela in their quest for an immediate end to these terrible and violent human rights violations, these acts of repression, and support them in their quest for a restoration of democracy for their country. Thank you.
Thank you, Special Representative Abrams. We'll take a few questions from the press. Please identify yourselves and your affiliation. NTN 24 had the first question.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you,
Gustavo Alegret, de NTN 24.
Gustavo Leder from ATN 24. I have two questions. One has to do with the work in Barbados, and the other one has to do with the press reports. Nothing else has been confirmed. I have the idea that you're joining efforts for the Venezuelan situation not to get any worse. Do you have a concern because the international interest is going down regarding the situation in Venezuela? Obviously, I was not part of that roundtable. Neither have I worked on the conclusions drawn by that group. Obviously, I do not have the reasons why that negotiation process is taking place. All I have is what comes from all the history behind these cases. Let me begin with a reflection. During this Oslo-Barbados process, there have been new political prisoners that were tortured, that were killed. This is a process that has by no means stopped. And both things appear to be tools used by the dictatorship, which on the one hand does one thing and with the other hand it does another thing. With one hand, it kind of brings ease to the international community, or trying to soften positions or including people into a process that becomes ongoing. And with the other hand, they continue to starve their people, murdering their people, and torturing their people, and making them victims of massacres, such as what I was saying earlier about the Pimon people. We have written several reports, some of which refer to previous roundtables or dialogues. I believe that in order to move forward with this process, however, we should assess like a first element, and that is, in order for that process to be successful, we will need to basically continue to pressure, and I'm talking about specifically the United States, putting pressure on the main areas that are cause of oppression to the Venezuelan people. That is the Cuban factor and the criminal usurping government by Nicolas Maduro. And that pressure is up to the United States to apply. So even more so than negotiating something at that negotiating table, what's going to be important is what happens outside that table. Pressure, sanctions, and some other credible threats by the U.S. government. If that pressure lets up, we will end up exactly like all the other dialogue processes, at least 4 or 5 that I have witnessed since 2014. There are some very clear elements about this. Christopher was talking about 15,000 Cubans in Venezuela. Some of the figures pointed to 22,000. So as long as those 15,000 or 22,000 Cubans are in Venezuela, it will be unthinkable to have a return to democracy for that country. There may be like a semi-institutional reorganization, but no return to true guarantees, because I know of no country in the world, especially in this country, where Cuba played a role to restore democracy in that country. It has never happened, and it will never happen. Sorry to tell you. It's not going to happen this time either. Now, in terms of the report on the Pimon people situation, I have talked about this, and this is my first contact with this topic. We wrote this report jointly with the Casla Institute, and it refers to new elements that include a lot of ethnic cleansing and genocide on a specific people, an indigenous people, that has been seriously displaced forcibly, but that has also been an ongoing victim of an extermination and massacre campaign, as told by the witnesses and the report itself. So these are new elements that continue to surface during this evidence collection, as well as the revelation of crimes against humanity and the reports that were filed before the International Court of Justice. But there's a main topic here that has to do with what we have been talking about today, and that is justice for human rights. Human rights justice depend on our memory, and depend on our commitment, and depend on our daily work. The long arm of human rights justice and the long memory of human rights justice depends on us day in and day out working to achieve justice. During this week, we saw 2 cases. One was the second level sentencing in Italy regarding the Condor Plan, which decades later shows that we must continue to work on human rights areas, regardless of whether or not the government presents an appeal, such as in the Condor Plan. But the victims, the family members, attorneys, civil organizations must always be there to demand and require things to be better. And that's the work of the OAS. Every single time, we must always keep our memory fresh. Today, we were in a ceremony to celebrate the 25 years after the AMIA attacks. And that case was also marred with immunity. And we must remember every single year, day in and day out, we must require justice, truth, and not repetition. And day in and day out, the OAS will be present, requesting the same things for the people of Venezuela. Dear Gustavo, unfortunately, we continue to see cases, torture cases, killings, extrajudicial killings. Unfortunately, always unfortunately, in the case of Venezuela, we have thousands of migrants every day. We have thousands or millions of people that are affected because of the humanitarian crisis. And so you, the press, and we at the OAS must renew our daily commitment, and we must continue to work just like the states need to continue working because they have a commitment with democracy and with human rights.
I answer briefly and then apologize for leaving. I have a call, actually, back at the State Department with a guy named Guaido, and I don't want to miss it, but I did want to make a comment. No one is going to forget the situation in Venezuela. Look at the last month or two. The meeting in Chile about democratic transition, the OAS General Assembly. Soon there will be a large meeting in Peru about Venezuela. Then there will be the UN General Assembly. This week, Greece recognized Juan Guaido. One of the first things that Prime Minister Mitsotakis did was to think and act about Venezuela, and he will not be the last head of government to do that. So there is no possibility of that happening. On the negotiations, I would only say I hope that no one in the room knows exactly what happened, because the only possibility of the negotiations working is if there is confidentiality. The United States wants a peaceful return to democracy in Venezuela. So needless to say, we hope the negotiations will succeed. Interim President Guaido and his team are not negotiating in Barbados because they trust the regime. They are negotiating to end the regime. Thank you.
Journalist in the back there.
Thank you so much. Yo tengo una pregunta para el señor.
I have a question for Mr. Samanavi. Well, first of all, thank you for being here and taking our questions. And I wanted to ask your questions back to you. What do you think needs to come after Bachelet's report? What else do you think the international community can do in order to find that cure that you referred to during your comments? Thank you. Several times I've said that the Venezuelan case is like a hostage situation. And when you have a hostage situation, you have two things. On the one hand, you have the negotiation, but on the other hand, there needs to be some kind of credible threat. So, and if people don't cease their actions, they will have to be arrested or some other way be forced out of that place. So what do I think needs to happen? Well, Nicolás Maduro's regime must feel that there's a credible threat, and the only ones that can make that their terrible threat are the governments that are abroad and that so far have supported President Juan Guaido.
Here in the booth.
Sí, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Sofia Pisani from TV Venezuela. what would the next steps be? Juan Guaidó, interim president of Venezuela, said that he wanted the TR to be applied. Is there a possibility for that to be applied, and how would that happen? Thank you.
Gracias, Sofía.
Thank you, Sophia. The Inter-American Treaty on Reciprocal Assistance is an agreement that was signed in 1948, whereby the nations in the hemisphere made a commitment to mutually assist each other in case of aggression. That agreement, Venezuela pulled away, I think, in 2012 from that agreement, and the National Assembly in the first round passed the act that authorizes President Juan Guaidó to ratify the treaty again. Next Tuesday, that bill would be discussed and hopefully passed. The next step would be the following. The TR has what we call the consultation or advisory body, which is made up by the members from the OAS Permanent Council who have voting right, and those are those who are member states. And there can be several options. It's not just a matter of a direct armed conflict happening, but there could also be a possibility of having assaults on sovereignty, independence, or the good governance of political systems. And therefore, the scope for the TR from the point of view of the reasons that could trigger their implementation are pretty broad. Now, what are the consequences? People oftentimes that the only consequence of a military intervention, the only consequence will be military intervention, but it's one of them, but it's not the only one. There's a series of decisions that the advisory body can take, which includes to call the diplomatic heads, to break diplomatic relations, break consular relations or economic ties, and all forms of communication with a given country. And we talk about communication, that means maritime, land, air, radio, and river. That is to say, this is back from 1948 when they talked about radio. So basically, complete isolation for the country. All those options are on the table. And the government, the intention of President Guaidó, when asking the National Assembly authorization to go back to reinstate the TR, is to have all these options available, which will be implemented to the extent that the friendly countries that are also part of the TR are willing to do it.
Buenas tardes, Jorge Agobián de la.
Good afternoon, from Voice of America. I would like to ask the Commissioner Simonovich. You were recently appointed by Juan Guaidó as Intelligence Commissioner. My question is, what degree of intelligence investigation will you engage in with the DEA regarding alleged drug trafficking ties to government, the Maduro administration? And the second question is, after listening all the testimonies and reports, is there like a red line for the Maduro regime as a result of all the serious accusations made against them? Well, like I've said in the past, there is some information that I handle that will be provided to the investigation or intelligence agencies in this country or others, because, for example, if there is information on the Colombian guerrilla, that information will be relayed to the Colombian government. And to the extent that that information will be processed, decisions will be made. In principle, they will be included in existing files, and if there's no file, then we will open one. All of this is aimed at undermining the foundation for this dictatorship. And if it helps to put an end to that dictatorship, then that's much better. So basically, I will be partnering with other government in order to work on police investigation and intelligence. Cristobal from Caracol Radio. Ivan, and I would like to talk about Santrich's location. Someone said that he was an apartment where he was living. He's a former senator. Do you know anything about Santrich's whereabouts based on what Fidera said and regarding the location of FARC dissidents in Venezuela? From what you just said, all I know about regarding Santrich's is what was said. Santrich's location is what Juan Manuel Figueroa said. I don't even know this person. I just saw his statement. So if he says that that's that, well, so be it. You know, I didn't even know that Ms. Piedad Córdoba had a house in Caracas. What was the other question? FARC dissidents location in Venezuela. That's public information. People from President Duque's administration have talked about ELN and FARC elements in Venezuela, and that information is already in the hands of people that are close to me, and in due course they will do the work that they have to do with President Duque's administration in order to confirm or deny those statements.
Soy David Alandete del diario.
David Lalatem from ABC, a newspaper from Spain. I wanted to ask the Secretary General. You mentioned that the United States has the key to the solution of the time. So were you talking about Cuba at this time, but with regard to the European Union and with the new European Commission? Because Mr. Borrell, who's somebody who said that the United States is acting like a cowboy with regard to Venezuela, is going to be in charge of the position that Federico Morini holds as a High Commissioner of Foreign Relations of the European Commission. So I wanted to ask you if you trust him, if he inspires trust in you, and looking at the career of Mr. Borrell, do you think there's going to be a favorable position of the Commission and the European Commission towards Venezuela with regard to Venezuela? It would be absolutely inappropriate to a priori come to a judgment about this before it even starts. But just when, in beginning his term, new position, new responsibilities, new challenges, everyone has the 100% full faith and credit of the Organization of American States. There's no way that would be otherwise. That's what my institutional responsibility is. Defense of democracy, defense of human rights, and non-contamination by dictatorships like the Cuban, which is engaged in other countries. That's what we're fighting against as an institution, and that's what there are two organizations in the world that are draw on the same principles of defending human rights, democracy, and with their own mechanism to defend democracy. It's the OAS and the European Union. So we hope to be able to act consistently therewith in the same way, both parties under the same responsibilities and undertake the same responsibilities and commitments to bring about democracy in Venezuela and Cuba. Beatriz Pascual from EFE for Ambassador Trujillo. I wanted to ask you, the Secretary General mentioned the importance of the United States towards Cuba. What other measures could the United States take? What is being assessed? What's on the table? We've seen over the last 6 months the measures that have been taken by the United States. We've seen total implementation of the Helms-Burton law, which was implemented by Secretary Pompeo, which has been pending for more than 18, 20 years. We've also seen cancellation of cruises and tourist visas to Cuba, which will have and has had an economic impact that's quite substantial, I would say. I think we have to provide an opportunity for these measures to be successful, and they will be, as Secretary Pompeo has said so, and as Ambassador Special Envoy Abrams has also said so. In Cuba, obviously, is not part of the solution. It's part of the problem. So we have to acknowledge that Cuba is doing everything possible for Venezuela to continue down the pike its started down in violating human rights and a lack of democracy that exists today in Venezuela with regard to the United States. And the president has said so several times. It's willing to do everything possible for Venezuela to get back to democracy. We've announced very drastic measures which haven't happened for many years. Canceling, for example, of contracts with the major leagues, baseball leagues. I think this is just the beginning. It's not the end of what we're willing to do. Here and then after another question. Good afternoon, Salina, FAP. Thank you for this press conference. So first I want to ask Ambassador Trujillo and Secretary Almagro with regard to sanctions, U.S. sanctions. The Secretary just said that they were necessary to apply these sanctions for there to be any success. What I'd like to know is that there's been people questioning that famine could be brought to Venezuela as a result of the sanctions. What do you think if the United States makes the sanctions even harsher over there, it cracks down even more with the sanctions for the next days? I believe that we've seen the sanctions, and the secretary is going to bring ruin to Venezuela. And how can they talk about the 4 million people who have left over the last few years? How can they speak about that when they talk about the 1,000% inflation rate? Before the first sanctions were slapped on them, most of the sanctions, American, were against private individuals. Up until recently against up to that time, millions have left their houses of Venezuelans. The inflation has gone through the ceiling, and then the economy is just falling apart. Total economic collapse of Venezuela, which you can read in the UN report of Ms. Bachelet. And so what we're trying to do is bring Maduro down, and there has to be he has to acknowledge his responsibility. There's sanctions of the U.S. sanctions have contributed to the economic collapse. Many of the sanctions weren't fully implemented until the end of May. So we have to realize that the economic collapse of Venezuela has been going on for more than 5 years, and the sanctions has only been hard hitting for less than 2 months. So I think from here on out, and especially Envoy Elliott Abrams has said, so the commitment of the United States will exert pressure on individuals or institutions as necessary who are violating human rights, who are involved in drug trafficking, who are involved in human rights violations. It's a commitment that we've always had, not only towards Venezuela, but towards the entire world, and we've done so in other places as well. We believe that this pressure is the reason why they're coming to the table. They won't come to the table without any specific pressure which is being exerted, that they have to, and the pressure that many who are involved in criminal activities are feeling this pressure as well. There's criticism that these sanctions are creating hunger, famine. Couldn't it be counterproductive for the interests of getting rid of Maduro? We don't accept this fact. Hunger didn't come about as a result of the sanctions. There's been hunger in Venezuela it's come about over the course of the last 5 years. 4 million people over the last 5 years have left. This has nothing to do with the sanctions. The sanctions, that most of the sanctions that have been slapped by the United States on Venezuela are against individuals, private individuals. The people who say that have to accept that it's the corrupt people. They're using the money. They steal it instead of getting food to the people. We know that that's not what it is. The corrupt people, they're enriching, and the people are dying of hunger, are starving. That's what's happening. The sanctions against private individuals slapped down by the United States. It's against ministers and senior level officials are against drug trafficking, not against the Venezuelan people. Of course, it's in good faith. Of course, it's not. It's tough, but it's the situation of the people. It's tough to separate them, but in pretty much it's not hurt the people. It's hurt these individuals. As Special Envoy Abrams has said, we are going to ratchet up the pressure, and we've seen the policy over the last 5 months. We've seen now the goodwill. Let's see if there really is good willingness to engage in dialogue, as Mr. Maduro has just begun to do. We're going to continue with the pressure until there's free elections and democracy back in Venezuela. Now? Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. Secretary, Mr. Secretary General, I wanted to ask you if you could give us an assessment of January to this date. You said in January it was eminent that Guaido was going to be able to come into power. Can you explain to us what's happened? Could you give us your view of these 6 months, which will be over the next month? What went wrong? What was missing? What did it? You've emphasized the U.S.'s role. The United States has emphasized the sanctions it slapped on Venezuela. There's been an appropriate strategy. Has it been appropriate? Has timing hasn't been right? What went wrong? This I raised in the press conference when the General Assembly took place. So I'll explain it again, once again. I said at that time, there's no magic formula or to put an end to dictatorships in the 21st century. In the 20th century, there were mechanisms that were similar to silver bullet, which could overnight change things, change political situations. But in this 21st century, these mechanisms under public international law have become obsolete, such mechanisms. And so these processes are about political build-up. And so to apply instruments that brings little by little democracy back in Venezuela, that's what we're doing. And that over the course of building it up, a cumulative process, so we can bring it back. That's what we have to engage in. A cumulative political process in this over the course of these 6 months, of course, has moved at a quite brisk pace. If you look at November and December of last year, 2018, and if you look at where we're at right now, we're obviously quite much closer to a solution of the Venezuelan crisis, and with regard to the dictatorship involved in the power grabbing and usurping of power of Nicolas Maduro. So what we have before us, there are a few factors that are absolutely fundamental that I have to point out. Delegitimization of the dictatorship of Venezuela, as we've been doing, and we've been very successful of this, with recognition of the president in charge, of the acceptance by acknowledgement by the Organization of American States members and of representatives of Guaido's mission before the General Assembly of the Organization of American States, and therefore the entire body, and it represents Venezuela in all the bodies of the organization. And we continue to exert pressure on the regime, as was said here. Further sections, further credible threats against the criminal members of the dictatorship of the regime. Crimes, shedding light on crimes against humanity, drug trafficking, systematic human rights violations, and other criminal activities that are linked to the usurping or grabbing of power, unlawful grabbing of power. So there are credible sanctions and threats. This will make a difference in the future, is what I say. Now, the Venezuelan dictatorship has never sat down at a negotiation table without pressure, willingly. there had to be pressure. In November of 2016, when we began a process of negotiation, in the Dominican Republic, there were negotiations. What happened? The UNASUR foreign ministers called upon this. That's why they did it. They only sit down to talk when it's in their best interest and when there's pressure. There has to be pressure, tough pressure exerted on them, and that's what gets them to the negotiating table. But when a dialogue process begins, it can't be reduced to, as it was in the past, to external, internal pressure against the dictatorship. It has to be ratcheted up. There needs to be a ratcheting up during the process. This has always been used. They say that's what they shoot down all the internal, international pressure. They say, you're pressuring us more and more. And then that's why we know these negotiations go nowhere. So I believe there's been a lot of progress made. We still have to continue to exert further pressure, heavier pressure. Greater effort must be done by the international community as well as us, the Venezuelan political community as well. But the path we've undertaken over these last 6 months has been improvised. We've made it up as we've gone along, and we've come up with those who are responsible have maintained international pressure, and those who are responsible for re-democratization of the political system in Venezuela domestically, they have to live up to their responsibilities to not leave the people high and dry and without any confidence, as has happened in the past. That's absolute key. Absolutely, absolute key. If you look at the dialogue discussion processes in the past, it's been a victim always of the Venezuelan political system. And if you look at the spokesman in 2014, practically he ceased to be a point person for that negotiation. If you look at 2016, there was no political reference point in that negotiation. If you look at the Dominican process as well, it wasn't a political point of reference either, and therefore could not be effective either. So it's in the hands of President Guaido to live up to his responsibility vis-a-vis the people and his responsibility to democracy, and to emerge strong from this negotiating process. No microphone for the question of the journalist. The credible threats means if you look a bit at 2 or 3 international actors that can exert this or make these friends, it has to do with financial, economic pressure and political pressure. These are the 3 types. The financial pressure mechanism and economic pressure mechanisms have to do with sanctions, of course. Political pressure is tied to ensuing actions that could be, there's a huge variety of them that have been used in several other different cases or instances in international crises of the same nature. Thank you very much for this press conference.